Hello everyone, welcome back to our second lecture on our Cold War series. Today we are going to be taking a look at the enemy within. We'll see how communists actually did infiltrate America, stole a lot of our top secret intelligence, and the Cold War is going to start to turn inward. In fact, we will start to turn against ourselves at one point. So I hope this lecture is a little bit shorter than last time. We covered a lot more information than I actually meant to, but that's all right. So today we're going to be talking about Cold War espionage, spies. We're going to see the rise of the Eisenhower presidency, and then we'll also see the rise of the so-called military-industrial complex. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So first of all, we are going to introduce the Red Scare. So back in our 1920s unit, we actually talked about this term Red Scare. That was the first Red Scare our country had gone into. But what happens in the 1950s is much more memorable, okay? So the Red Scare is this fear about communism in America. Now, some of this, I will tell you, is much overblown. The idea that communists were lurking everywhere within the United States, spies for the Soviet Union were everywhere, could perhaps even be your neighbors, right? These kind of fears were often unfounded. But the fact is there were spies here. There were a certain level, and many of them were captured. But this fear of spies is really going to transform America and how we begin to move forward. Now, I have hit on this theme throughout multiple units in our American history course, and that is when, excuse me, when our nation on a vast scale becomes fearful, okay, when we have this collective fear, it often leads to the giving up of our rights. It often leads to the giving up of civil rights. We've seen this many times. We saw this in our last unit with the Japanese internment camps, this fear that maybe the Japanese Americans were against us, that there were spies among them. And then that led to the mass incarceration of, frankly, many thousands of innocent Japanese Americans. We've also seen it in other areas. We'll see it in the future, after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, things like that. Same thing's happening here. There's this fear. Much of it, some politicians will actually play up this fear for their own gain, and it just serves to make matters worse. So we're going to take a look at one group that was very much responsible for pushing this fear, and they were called the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And they were created to specifically investigate disloyalty among U.S. citizens. So, as you can probably imagine from the very beginning, your loyalty being questioned, and in particular by a group of congressmen, being asked to take oaths to prove that loyalty, we are, frankly, on a very slippery slope here. And there was a lot of concern, that people are having to kind of prove their innocence instead of the other side proving their guilt. But what will collectively be known as HUAC was created to investigate communism. And I will tell you, for the most part, really did not uproot any communists, but instead just instilled a fear that communism was lurking around every single corner. Now, one area that Congress decided to focus on, and frankly often still focuses on today, is the media, but specifically Hollywood. There were 10 actors and actresses, directors, writers, that frankly decided not to give in to this questioning, because what HUAC was doing was summoning people. They were actually subpoenaing, issuing a subpoena to individuals, requiring them to come testify in front of Congress. And many of these individuals felt that it wasn't necessarily their duty, that they had to testify, that frankly, just giving in to what amounted to a witch hunt, okay? A classic witch hunt that, we've seen throughout American history, where, again, the people that are being accused often have to prove their innocence instead of the other side proving their guilt. Well, what became known as the Hollywood 10. These were 10 individuals that decided to stand up to Congress, refuse to testify, whether they were a communist or not, telling the Congress that they had no business, engaging in their personal beliefs. Now, the result for most of these actors and actresses and writers, directors, was that most of them were blacklisted. That is a term referring to when people are basically, left off of casting lists, or frankly just wouldn't be hired because of kind of this taint of this backlash from refusing to testify. So many of these people stood up, frankly, for what was right. I mean, today we see it for what it is. We saw it as a witch hunt, and they stood up for their beliefs, but frankly, many of them paid with their lives, because when they refused to testify, even the FBI was going after some of these people. I know I read the story of one gentleman who was a pretty high up producer in Hollywood, refused to testify just because he didn't think it was right. The government was asking him his personal beliefs on these political issues. And the FBI continued to harass him over the years, to the point where his wife actually left him, divorced him. He wasn't hired in Hollywood ever again. I mean, it ruined this man's life just because he was standing up against this government witch hunt. So, it's having a very real effect. The fear of communism is having a very real effect on people in this era. Some politicians, of course, do the wrong thing to build up their own resume, and perhaps there's no greater person or no one more synonymous with the Red Scare than Senator Joseph McCarthy, Republican from Wisconsin. McCarthy made a name for himself early on. He was not a very well-known senator, not a very powerful senator, but he becomes kind of the head of this witch hunt. One day he's speaking to a small group of supporters, and he holds up a slip of paper, and he tells them that on this slip of paper, he has about 200 names of people within the United States government that are card-carrying members of the Communist Party. Well, of course, murmurs, immediately go through the crowd, like 200 people in the government, like this causes a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and of course, everybody's wanting to see these lists. And he's saying, the investigation's going on, but we will identify these people later on. Now, in reality, what McCarthy was doing was practicing shock and awe. He didn't have any names. He actually didn't know of any communists. He was trying to make a name for himself, and he definitely did that, but for all the wrong reasons. Ultimately, McCarthy will fall out of favor after these trials, which even become so popular that they're televised. People are watching this on daily television. But McCarthy's claims seem to grow larger and larger, and that these conspiracies are getting bigger and bigger. And then all of a sudden the public realizes that he's never actually provided any evidence or identified a single communist. McCarthy was in it for himself, and the truth is he knew of no communists in the government, and he knew that by touting this line that he would make himself, frankly, perhaps a long political career. Eventually, he's not only discredited, he actually goes after the military at one point, suggesting that some higher-up generals in the military are not loyal to the United States, that they are communists being paid for by the Soviet Union. And at that point, he's actually openly kind of lambasted on television with one of the people he's interviewing, just saying, have you no decency, sir? Like, you're going after the men and women that are defending this country on a daily basis with no proof. People eventually saw it for what it is, which often is the case. With all of this being said, I don't want to present it as if there were no communists here, because espionage was a major part of the Cold War, and they had spies and we had spies. So let's take a look at some of the biggest spy cases that existed for both sides. One of the first major cases of Soviet espionage here in the United States, and in fact this directly led to the Soviets developing an atomic bomb, and that is the case of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Now, both the Rosenbergs had ties to the Soviet Union. They were members of the American Communist Political Party, and eventually it was found that, in particular, Julius was selling nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. Now, his wife, Ethel, would also be found guilty of this. I will tell you, historians often kind of separate the two out. There's not nearly as much evidence that Ethel had a role in this as much as Julius did. He absolutely sold secrets to the Soviet Union, which enabled them to create a nuclear bomb, which of course made the Cold War that much colder. Eventually, the Rosenbergs would be tried, found guilty, and would both be executed for their role in espionage. Now, it wasn't just the Soviets spying on us, we were doing the same thing to them. We'd be naive to think that this has stopped today. We spy on many of our allies, as even Edward Snowden showed us with the PRISM program that the NSA has been running for a very long time. If you're interested in this topic, I would highly suggest you read up on it. But at this period, the United States was engaging in espionage of the Soviet Union, not only with spies on the ground, but also in the air. We had developed a top-secret plane called a U-2 plane. You can see a picture of it down in the bottom left-hand corner. You'll notice the design of that plane is much different than a normal plane. It has a very long wingspan. It has a very slender body. And that is because this plane was designed to basically carry two things, a pilot and a camera. Now, this U-2 spy plane could fly at such high altitudes that it was thought to be unshootable. The Soviets didn't have the rocket technology to track and shoot down this plane that flew at such high altitudes, which with such a powerful camera to take pictures of the ground below it. And that is until they shot one down. American pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down out of the skies of the Soviet Union, and the Soviets did capture him. Now, this was a very embarrassing moment for the United States, not only them proving that we were catching us in the act of spying on them, but also the fact that we had actually sent Gary Powers on a kind of a suicide mission. They found a few things along his personal belongings when they arrested Francis Gary Powers, including some rubles, some dollars, a handgun, but also there was a little quarter, a little U.S. quarter, and they thought at first this is kind of strange that they would include this, until they realized that that quarter had a small needle embedded in it, and on top of that needle was actually poison. And that was, if Francis Gary Powers got shot down like he did, if he so chose, he could actually commit suicide and avoid being captured. So, of course, the Soviets are going to play this up big time. You know, the fact that the United States, they're the aggressors. They're the ones that are sending their pilots on suicide missions to spy on the Soviet Union. And it is an embarrassing moment, but Eisenhower, frankly, never apologizes. In fact, he says, you guys spy on us, we spy on you. That's kind of how this game works. Now, Eisenhower, the man I've been mentioning a couple times, we've mentioned Eisenhower before. If we didn't, he was the he was the supreme Allied commander in World War II. He was an American who was basically in charge of all Allied movement in the war. Now, the war is over, and he has decided to run as a Republican. He is a very moderate Republican, very, I would say, he's fiscally conservative, but somewhat socially liberal. We're going to see him actually send in troops to defend civil rights decisions that the Supreme Court passes down in the 1950s. But he is a Republican, and he's very well favored in the United States. He will win the election both in 1952 and then also in 1956. He's reelected. Let's take a look at some of the things that Eisenhower pushed for as president. As I said, this idea of a modern Republican, fiscally conservative, socially liberal. So Republicans, I will tell you, we're getting into a very interesting period in politics, political history, because the Republicans and Democrats on many issues are going to start switching, but in particular on the issue of civil rights. We have seen up until this time that the South has strongly been Democratic ever since the time of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. What we're going to see is that it's starting to shift, that the Democrats are going to start kind of leading the charge on civil rights under Johnson in the 1960s, and then we're going to see kind of a shift, especially under Richard Nixon. I won't say anti-civil rights, but definitely kind of slowing down some of the more progressive actions, such as busing and I'm getting well ahead of myself here. Let's stick to what we have in front of us. So Eisenhower's military spending. One interesting thing I've always found to be the case is that when you look at the presidents who had the highest possible levels in the military, Eisenhower, Washington, almost every single one of these presidents, when they are president, will actually decrease the size of the military. Now today, that's almost unheard of for anyone to run and decrease military spending, but historically that's not been the case. In fact, what you see under Eisenhower, a man who made his entire career out of the military, is that military spending will decrease from $50 billion to $34 billion. Now, part of that is because Eisenhower is going to try his best to avoid conventional wars. He has now been a part of 2 world wars, and those have been so devastating that Eisenhower is one of these men that truly is willing to do anything to avoid those wars in the future. So instead of focusing on big national policies that could lead to another world war, instead what Eisenhower is going to do is try to focus more on covert action, okay? Action behind the scenes, using agencies such as the CIA. Now, this is a new era of both foreign policy, but just kind of a new era of American history. A lot of the fighting is going to be happening kind of in the shadows, and that brings some successes, but it also brings some challenges to the status quo. Now, over the next few decades, the CIA is going to lead even revolutions, assassinations. We are going to overthrow leaders. We're going to spy on many of our even allies. In fact, I've listed just a few of the coups that America was responsible for in the 1950s and 60s, some of which happened under Eisenhower. Iran in 1953, that put the Shah in place, overthrowing basically the democratically elected leader of Iran. And that would also lead down the road to another revolution, very anti-American revolution. Guatemala, we see in Central America, an anti-communist coup there. Also, many of these coups set up dictators in place of communists. The CIA would support a dictator who supports America, even if they're killing their people en masse, instead of having a communist, even a mile closer to the U.S. border. Even Africa and the Congo in 1960, and of course, most famously, South Vietnam, where we'll see a military coup that was set up there that ultimately led to the Vietnamese War. This map, I think, is very telling. This is showing all the military and CIA interventions since World War II. It is very bright. There are a lot of countries on this map. So I think, we're seeing a major shift in American history here because, believe it or not, the very last time America declared war was against Nazi Germany in 1941. But as you can see from this map, that is not the last time America's been in a war. So I would argue that we've betrayed a lot of our, frankly, constitutional requirements to go into conflict. And frankly, the role of the executive branch, the role of the president, is greatly expanding under Eisenhower. He is single-handedly able to topple regimes and send troops into countries throughout the world without the American public even knowing about it. That can be a problem later on, and not exactly what I think our founding fathers intended for when we engage in military conflict, but the world is changing. So, how much role should, how secretive should all of this be? Now, moving on, back to some domestic issues here. One of the longest lasting impacts that Eisenhower will have is we will pass what's called the Federal Highway Act. You can see a picture of the interstate system in the lower left-hand corner. This is one of the most modernizing moves that America has ever gone through. Over 40,000 miles of highway will be put in place, including most of the interstates that we know today. Both 70, I-70 runs east and west through Missouri, through Kansas City, where we live, but also, 71, or I guess it's called 49 now, right there along. These are major arteries that will connect the United States in a way that's never been connected before. And not only does that help people, to more easily travel, get there faster and safer than ever before, but think about what it does for a business. The ability of people to move goods throughout the country. Semi-trucks are one of the biggest industries in how goods are moved throughout this country, and that would not be possible without the interstate system. And also, there is a military need for this as well. God forbid if there were to ever be an actual invasion, you got to be able to move your military from one coastline to the other as quickly as possible. The interstate system does help with that. Now let's finish off Eisenhower by taking a look at, again, some more of his foreign policy concerns. Under Eisenhower, we're going to see that the focus of the Cold War, which very early on was on Europe, right? The division of Germany, specifically Berlin, the Berlin airlift, all of that. Instead, we're going to see this focus shift to Asia. Europe and Berlin is not as much the flashpoint as it was in the early days of the Cold War. Instead, Asia is that new flashpoint. Remember the domino theory. Hey, listen, if we allow one country to fall to communism, then their neighboring countries will fall. And then you have, if China falls, well, then you have, perhaps Thailand fall, and then maybe Vietnam fall, and maybe India. There's another billion people country that falls to communism. So, Eisenhower is going to attempt to try and slow this process of communism spreading throughout the world. And that includes some areas in the Middle East. We're going to see a major moment, a major flashpoint happen in the Middle East, and that is after Egypt moves in and what they call nationalizing the Suez Canal. The Egyptian government takes it over. It had previously been kind of a collective arrangement. But the Egyptian government feels that it's on their land, so therefore they should be the ones in control. So they move in and nationalize it. And then there is a secret agreement formed between Israel, which is a brand new country formed after World War II, France, and the United Kingdom. They decide to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt. And of course, the Soviet Union and the United States are kind of playing this. This is the first of what we call, well, maybe not the first, but the next in what we call kind of a proxy war or a proxy conflict. This has the makings to blow up into a big situation, right? With the Soviets, if they, sponsor Egypt and we sponsor these other sides, it could really turn into something very ugly very quickly. Ultimately, the United Nations once again steps in, their main purpose, their main role, and they do basically take control of the Suez Canal from all invading forces. And they will basically be in charge of operating the canal for the time being. Eisenhower was the one to pressure the United Nations to take on that role. So we've already, here within the first 10 years after its creation, we've seen them used at least twice in some major events. Now the final thing I would like to focus on is Eisenhower's farewell speech. And, I'll remind you, as I said earlier, Eisenhower was a man who truly had made the military his career. And, as one of America's top generals over the last few decades, I find his farewell speech to be very telling. Now, it has been tradition ever since the time of Washington that every president would give a farewell speech at the end of their term, and Eisenhower follows suit. And in fact, he gives one of the first televised farewell addresses. So this is coming into the living rooms of most Americans. And what he describes, he not only focuses on many of the successes that they have had, but he also describes some of his concerns, things that he is seeing, trends that are happening in the United States that he has major concerns about the future. Now, he is going to coin a term here that ultimately becomes known as the military-industrial complex. And it almost has a conspiracy-sounding name. But what the military-industrial complex is that Eisenhower was referring to was he saw this cooperation growing between the military, Congress, and the companies, the corporations that make the products for war. right? So they're selling weapons. They're selling weapons systems, planes and tanks and rockets. They're selling them to the military. The Congress is paying them. And those military industries are often kicking back a lot of money to congressmen to aid them in their re-election campaigns. And this concerned him because when war becomes profitable for all of those parties, you will have more war. I want to read you part of his speech, and bear with me, please. I can't remember if this is Eisenhower as he's giving this speech, and I think this is very important, so I want to make sure we understand this speech. So deal with me as I read through this. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. I think that's a very telling speech. And again, from a man who made an entire career out of the military to warn us that we are spending too much money on the military, and that every single dollar you put towards this is a dollar that could be used to feed the poor, to house the homeless, to build schools, to build hospitals. He's absolutely right. Now, I will tell you, I think overall his warning, as many of our farewell address warnings have occurred, is very apt. Okay, let's take a look at. Let's take a look at some numbers here. Number one, why this has actually happened. First of all, the military industry creates a lot of jobs, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's the best part of all of this, is that jobs across the country are made. And what often military corporations do, those that are building these weapon systems, is they spread the job out, where if you're making a single plane, well, you actually part it out of 50 states. All right, so if Congress votes against that plane in the future, now you're taking away jobs from all 50 states. So now you have politicians that are actively pushing for some of these very, very expensive weapons systems. For example, the F-35 not only is sourced from 250 locations overall, but 90 congressional districts. The B-2 bomber, in the 1980s, some members of Congress said we need to cut the B-2 bomber. But then they realized that the B-2 bomber was made from parts that were created over 46 different states, 383 of the 435 congressional districts. Ultimately, what we're referring to is a big problem today. It's called pork barrel politics and political engineering. What ends up happening is that projects will often take on unrelated issues. So, there may be a bill that comes forward to redo the interstate through Missouri. But a bill basically an amendment gets attached to that bill, to build, a new B-2 plane. Well, those two issues have nothing to do with one another, but it's one way that they're able to get a lot of this legislation pushed through. And again, there's not many politicians that have won elections based off of sizing down the military. But Eisenhower himself would have argued against that. Today, 44 out of the top 100 weapons manufacturers are from the United States, and they account for 66% of the overall arms sales in the United States. 7 of the top 10 contracts in the American government, the largest contracts that the American government has with private industry, is in the weapons industry. And those in the top 10 companies made a total of $26 billion in profit last year. The top executives making $96 million in just simply bonuses. And that is taxpayer money. So, perhaps it's not as conservative as we may think. Guys, that'll do it for Eisenhower and the first era of the Cold War. Next time, we will see the emergence of a brand new young candidate in John F. Kennedy. And in particular, we'll talk about his policies. We'll talk about some of the failed foreign policies he had, some of the successful ones. Space exploration will be a topic. And sadly, we will also focus on the assassination. So all you conspiracy theorists, get ready. We'll talk about some conspiracies next time. Guys, thank you so much for listening. And as always, email me if you have any questions. Thanks.